first of all, I'd like to thank TVS for inviting me here today to share some thoughts on clinical management of biofilms. But first of all, I would like to inquire how many non-nurses are in the audience? Do we have any physicians amongst that group? Podiatrists? Academic researchers? Commercial members? Okay, thank you. That helps give me some form of balance as to how I should proceed. So, how do biofilms affect my clinical practice? I've not included my as the personal pronoun. I'm referring the my onto you guys, because I want to explore with you how biofilms have affected your clinical practice. So let's see what unfolds. It's all about choices. Now, there are 3 doors there. First of all, I'm just going to discuss or present to you 2 doors, and we'll come on to the 3rd a little bit later. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, you are all well experienced in managing acute wounds. How has that management of acute wounds been translated into managing biofilms, otherwise known as chronic wound infection? Have you changed your practice from acute mode into chronic mode? Sudden silence. So what's happened? Have you changed your practice? Yes or no? You have? I'm not going to ask you for specific details, so you're off the hook. Anybody else? Have you changed your practice? Or are you still sticking with acute wound management? Mostly sticking with acute wound management. Okay, so now I know where we have to explore. Because if you're making the wrong choice, if you're still sticking with acute mode, you're not going to get anywhere, or you're not going to get very far. So I'd like to pick up on what Val explored, the planktonic and sessile relationship. Because it's all about behavior. Now, the term planktonic comes from the ancient Greek, planktos, and it means literally drifter. And as Val clearly explained, these entities float around in fluid, and they are looking for a place which they can attach and then develop into biofilm phenotype. So they are plankton-like. They float around. But this phenotype is fiercely competitive. They're competitive with other bacteria. They want to dominate in many instances. And they are extremely predatory. And that's what gives rise to the host reaction that we all rely on: redness, swelling, heat, and pain. It's how the body responds to this predatory invasion by planktonic phenotype. On the other hand, biofilm bugs are attached to a surface, and they behave quite differently. Their remit is not to dominate, not to kill. Their whole purpose is to survive. So they behave completely differently. And we can learn from this quote from Costerton in '99, biofilms constitute a protected mode of growth that allows survival in a hostile environment. They want to survive. So they act differently to planktonic. Their mode of action is more parasitic. They want to live off the host. They don't want to kill them. They don't want to kill the host. They want to survive, and they often live off the exudate, the fluid that's expressed in the exudate, and the minerals and nutritious agents that are within that exudate. So they do not have a vested interest in killing off the host. So when did this science of biofilms start? How long ago do you think we were made aware of biofilms? 1800s, 1900s, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s? Where in history did it all kick off? When was it turned into a science? What's that? 20 years ago? Not bad. That is the first paper that I can find on biofilms. I don't know if Val has anything before that. You'd agree? Okay, 78. So Bill Costerton, who's generally regarded as the father of biofilms, he was a Canadian. He died 2 years ago in May 2012. And he was a great lover of the outdoors. He loved climbing mountains and hiking. He loved the wilderness. And sometime after this paper, published in 78, he wrote about his experience that led to the production of this paper, how biofilms stick, how bacteria stick. And what he declared was that he was hiking in the mountains in a place called Bugaboo Spire Glacier in British Columbia. And he had an embarrassing fall. He fell backwards on some granite rocks that were by the side of the glacial lake. And as he came in contact with the surface, he noticed this slimy material that drew his attention. Now, at that point in history, if you took a sample from glacial waters, you would expect to grow about 8 bugs in 1 ml of fluid. So very, very low bacterial count because of the cold environment and that this water has come from glaciers. But when he took this sample off this rock and back to the lab, what he found was it was teeming with bacteria. Many, many bacteria, that more than you would expect to find in a sample at that cold altitude. And that set him off on this path of investigation, and later on he published widely on chronic infections, especially involving indwelling medical devices. And he stated on many occasions that bacteria grow in well-developed glycocalyx enclosed biofilms. We tend to use the term EPS now, extracellular polymeric substance, in place of glycocalyx, but that was the term used at the time. And so his investigations and others led on to investigations in science looking at the biochemistry and genetics of biofilm formation and function, and a search for new methods for medical diagnosis. But where we need to take note is that the development of science within this arena is needed, but we need to put it in a clinical context and firmly grasp the fact that biofilms create a therapeutic problem. We cannot continue looking at chronic infections with our acute eyes on. We need to switch our vision and consider that these are chronic infections and really need an entirely different mode of management. And as Val indicated before, biofilms are resistant to conventional antimicrobials and also your immune host defenses. So we need to understand biofilms, we need to get to grips with them, and also learn ways in which we can control them. So this takes us back 150, 60 years. Who's heard of Robert Koch? Anybody? One? Only one? Nobody's heard of Robert Koch. Well, we've a lot to be grateful for from Robert Koch and his studies. He engaged heavily in examining the anthrax bacillus. And from his co-workers, Walter Hess, we had the development of the agar medium, which is used in every lab. Tons of agar are plated into Petri dishes every day, and it's the traditional growth medium for microbiology laboratories. And mentioning the Petri dish, that was one of Robert Koch's associates, Richard Petri, developed the Petri dish. So we've a lot to be thankful for this fine Victorian hair-suited gentleman. What he said was, a number of criteria need to be met for a microorganism to be identified as a disease-causing agent. And that led to what we call Koch's postulates. They are all important, but I'd like to pick on this first one. Microorganism must be evident in all episodes of the disease. Does that apply to biofilm infection? No, because we can't grow biofilms in the laboratory. So if you can't grow them, how can you identify them? And how can you satisfy the first of Koch's postulates? The microorganism must be evident. Well, if you can't find it, it can't be there. But it is there. We don't have the technology in order to culture them in the traditional mode. And if we look at the fourth one, the microorganism must be isolated from the host that is diseased. The same applies. We cannot isolate biofilm phenotypical bacteria. So if we can't identify them, how do we know that we treat them or when to treat them? And how do we know when we've been successful if we have treated them? So it's all very difficult, isn't it? And that is what makes it very difficult for us to switch from acute mode into chronic mode in their treatment. But let's have a little look at that. Now, this paper was published tail end of last year, and these researchers looked at sternal wounds, and they declared that they had identified biofilms in these sternal wounds. And these are two scanning electron micrographs. The one on the left, as you can see, is at ×60 magnification, and these are sternal wires. And this substance on the sternal wire has been magnified and is identified